My name is Jakob Macke. I'm a computational neuroscientist. I originally studied mathematics in Oxford. I was interested in sort of real, pure mathematics, and then I got more and more interested in statistics and probability theory as my undergraduate went on. And then in my last summer of undergraduate, I ended up doing a summer internship in Cold Spring Harbor Laboratory in New York, and that kind of opened my eyes to the world of biology and completely sort of sidetracked my career, and that sort of eventually ended up me becoming a computational neuroscientist. So in Cold Spring Harbor, I worked with Karel Svoboda and Alex Kulakov, and I was fortunate. I think at the time I didn't realize how fortunate I was to be working in an environment where there were many great computational neuroscientists around me. So although I had no idea at all about computational neuroscience, I managed to get a lot of inspiration and managed to ask a lot of stupid questions. One of the people that were working in Cold Spring Harbor at the time was a postdoc called Christian Machens. So he's one of the very first computational neuroscientists I ever saw in my life. And so you see how influential that was on me, that I'm sort of stayed in that direction. After I then did a PhD with Bernhard Schulkopf, initially in Tübingen, because I still wanted to do statistics and probability theory things. And then, kind of luckily for me, Matthias Bethke joined the Bernhard's department and then set up his own research group. And that allowed me to work with Matthias Bethke, who kind of has exactly the mixture of machine learning and neuroscience that I was interested in. And after my PhD, I went to the Gatsby unit, which obviously is possibly the place that tries to combine machine learning with computational neuroscience. And after that, I returned to Tübingen to set up my own group there, and then 2 years later moved to the Research Center Bonn, where I currently am. I will speak about neural data analysis, the basics. I will try to convey a sense of how I think probabilistic models or statistical models should be used for neural data analysis. In the first part, this will be relatively kind of philosophical and or fuzzy. In the second part, I will then talk about a particular model that tends to be very popular for neural data analysis, something called a generalized linear model that many of you will have used before. I'm talking about it both because it's useful and because it's just a simple example that can be used to demonstrate a number of points that also are valid more widely. And then as a third part, I might get to talking about how to do data analysis with models that have latent variables. And if there's additional time, which very likely will not happen, I will talk about how these settings can be extended to models where you don't have likelihoods. So you want to do statistics on models, but there's no explicit formulas for computing likelihoods, how you can still do some kind of Bayesian inference in these situations. So on to the philosophy part. I want to start by just discussing what I mean by statistics, and which is somewhat different to what many kind of applied students and researchers in neuroscience and related fields think of statistics. So when you ask people what is statistics, the first answer is typically it gives you the p-values you need to publish, right? So this is the main motivation for using statistics. If you ask more, it often says, well, you need to have summary statistics, like you need to average and all that stuff, so you can analyze your data. And then if you ask more, you will typically get just a lot of names for different techniques, right? You want to find outliers, and you want to compute correlation sizes, correlation coefficients, and to quantify effect sizes. There's a lot of different tests that people might mention, like chi-square and bootstrap and all that stuff. If they've been to a more advanced course, they might even say linear regression or classification. If they've been to this course, they might even say GPFA. So all of these are valid and important techniques in statistics, but this sometimes leaves the impression that statistics is a bunch of techniques you kind of have to use to get something. And I think that kind of belies the underlying philosophy or rationale for doing statistics, or the way that I think statistics should be done. And you can view statistics as, so the answer to statistics, which is the more satisfying to me, is that statistics is a principled approach for deriving knowledge from noisy and or limited data to make informed decisions. So in that sense, statistics is actually a life skill, and that's why I actually think statistics should be taught in high schools much more than this, because it doesn't apply to neuroscience. It just applies to kind of making rational decisions under uncertainty, which, as Mate talked about, is something that not only scientists face, but animals and humans face as well.
Do you distinguish in your own mind a difference from variability
in my mind. So
you're talking about your perspective on the statistic.
So variability is just an observation that if you repeat something multiple times, there is you don't get the same answer. So I think variability is, I should really have said variable data. Noisy implies that that variability is something you don't want, which when I say noisy, it doesn't actually mean that, but I know that typically is understood as saying that noisy is something unwanted. I should really say variable, yeah, because that is the. But when it comes to decision making and trying to derive knowledge, variability often is a nuisance. And there's two key principles that might be relevant in that. So one thing that statistical models do is that they allow you to a way to both express knowledge and express uncertainty. So I think that's something important. The statistical model, and that is actually in contrast to many other models, doesn't only try to convey what you know, but also be explicit about what you don't know, what you cannot constrain by your data. And the second one is this focus on quantifying the performance of your model, because or of whatever procedure you're working with, because in some sense you do want to make decisions and you need to attach numbers to things, and you might want to rank things, and sort of Bayesian statistics or statistics more general gives you a framework for putting numbers on things even when there's variable and noise. So if one translates these general points, still very general, to how one tries to use statistical modeling to answer a scientific question, there's a way to do this, which in some sense is common sense, but is also sometimes referred to as Bock's loop. Bock is a famous statistician that I think actually was the first one to say this classical sentence of all models being wrong, but some models being useful. So I've modified this. So my Bock's loop is not what he wrote down in his papers. So obviously, if you want to do science, you have to start with a scientific question that can be in computational neuroscience some theory you want to prove or disprove. Then based on the question you have, you often design an experiment, or if you're a theorist, you try to get data from someone else. But there's some process where you need empirical observations to base your reasoning on. And then the next step will typically be that you do some exploratory analysis on this data, right? So at this point, there's not really much of a model or concrete test. And when you do that exploratory analysis, you might often find that there's some problem with the data. There's some property in the data that you don't really like, or that might mean it's difficult to get back to the question, in which case you then go back to designing a new experiment or getting some other data. The other thing that you might discover during exploratory analysis is that there's actually just some other effect in the data that you didn't actually sort of conceive of when it was collected, but that you want to follow up on. So this often happens in exploratory analysis, in which case it should allow you to formulate a new question and then kind of go back into that loop. As you will see, that loop is actually, it's really Bock's loop. It doesn't have an end. You're never done. It's this iterative process where you always end up to formulating a new scientific question. So it's a very safe way of staying busy. So once you're at that point where you have some data that after exploratory analysis you're satisfied with, then you need to design a statistical model. And the statistical model obviously needs to be such that it's relevant to the scientific question you're answering or you're trying to answer. And once you have your statistical model and you have data, well, then you can fit that model to data. In Bayesian statistics, you wouldn't, fitting model is often inference. So you try to do inference over your parameters given the data. And importantly, that is not when you're done, but this is really when kind of Bock's loops start properly, because then you have to start criticizing that model. So in some ways, you have to try shooting down your own model, and that might result in a number of different outcomes. So firstly, you might realize that the parameters of your model are just not constrained by your data. For example, you might have two statistical models, and you might want to say which one of the two models is a better explanation of your data, and you might just realize that they're equally good explanations. So that might motivate you to design a new experiment, either design a new experiment or get more data from the same experiment. You might have heard sometimes when people say you're not allowed to kind of look to do this kind of test and collect more data when you do hypothesis testing. That's, I think, on the one hand, it's true when you look at p-values. On the other hand, this comes from a problem that has to do with just the prevalence of using hypothesis testing for proving or disproving quote-unquote scientific theories, and I'm not going to talk about p-values, but there are some subtleties that might cause you to be cautious in running through this loop. The other outcome that you might find, and this is the most likely outcome, is that your model fails. There's some effect in your data that you're interested in that it doesn't capture, in which case, rather than collecting new data, you go back to improving your model, right? So then, and typically this results in either using a different model or a more complicated model. So you see there's now many loops that you can spend time in. Once in a while, you will be lucky and you will be satisfied that your parameters are well constrained and the model at least captures the effect you're interested in which case that means you have made a statement that allows you to narrow down or disprove the original question that you started off with, and then puts you back to that point, and you can start running through box loop again. So all of that is common sense, and all of you would probably agree this is how you go about your daily business, but sometimes I think it's useful to explicitly write down where the different points are, and we could even discuss more where there's more arrows to draw in, but I think it's pretty full as it is. Okay, there's a particular subset of statistics. I'm not going to talk in detail about why frequency statistic or why Bayesian statistic. I think when I think about statistics, Bayesian statistics is in many ways has many advantages over alternate formulation. By now that is the common view. And in Bayesian statistics, the central operation that we do all the time that you've already heard about in Marte's talk is that we need to calculate, and typically that means approximate the posterior distribution over parameters given data. And mathematically, this is a simple operation. So we might have two different parameters, let's say, and we have some prior distribution which captures our prior knowledge about these different parameters. And this plot looks actually reasonably similar to some of the empirical plots that Marte showed. That was not by design, but I think might make it easier for you to do the mapping between the two. Then we get a likelihood. So the likelihood specifies which of those parameters are consistent with our data. So in this case, after observing some data x, we see that x is much more consistent with some of these parameters than with others. And then in the end, we get the posterior by just multiplying the two and renormalizing. So in the end, the posterior distribution naively just corresponds to those regions of parameter space that are both consistent with my data and with the prior, right? And it just comes from that product. So if one of those two terms here, so do we have another pointer, or is that, do we have oh, there's another. Okay. Sorry, Marta, I think I ran out of battery, I guess. So just if one of those terms is 0, then the whole thing is 0, right? So that's it has to be consistent with both. So that is simple. It's just the multiplication. There is a subtle detail that I think is keeping much of machine learning or probabilistic machine learning busy, and that is this posterior is hard to compute. And the posterior is hard to compute for primarily one reason, and that is while to compute something that's proportional to posterior, you just have to take this multiplication. To actually get the posterior, it has to be a probability, so you have to normalize this. So you have to divide this by all possible, by the probability of x total, by the integral over this thing over all possible thetas, and computing that integral is typically hard. So in almost all cases, computing that integral is hard. So to complete Bayes' rule, we need to divide by the denominator, and that's the hard thing to compute. It's typically easy to get something that's proportional to the posterior. And this is also the reason for a very commonly used hack, is to say, well, we're interested in the full posterior distribution, but for practical data analysis, let's just find the peak. Because to find the peak of something, you don't need the normalizer, right? Because where that peak is doesn't matter on how you scale things up and down. And that peak is typically called the maximum a posteriori, or the map. And the underlying assumption is that really all probability that matters is near the peak, and you don't have to care about the stuff around, which as a full true Bayesian will make you cry. But this often, I mean, firstly, it's often done in practice, and secondly, there's some cases where you don't have any alternative. There's an in-between solution, and that is to saying, well, we don't want to just have the peak, and we can't estimate the full posterior. So maybe we can approximate the full posterior by a Gaussian. So for example, we find something that approximates the mean of that distribution, and we find the covariance of things around here. And then if we assume this to be a Gaussian, then this is not the full posterior. So this is not accurate, but it's not as bad as just taking the limit. Okay. So this is a 2D simple example, just to as two small examples from my own work. We can define and calculate these posteriors over much more complicated objects. So this is a posterior distribution we calculated over orientation preference maps, where each of those is a sample of an orientation preference map that's equally consistent with a given imaging data set. Or you can calculate posterior distributions over receptive fields, where as you absorb more data, you get from this very sort of rich posterior where many different samples, you can sample very different receptive fields from your posterior to something that is much more constrained. In the end, you have a very peak posterior, so that there's one receptive field that is consistent with the data. All right. After these general philosophical remarks, I'm going to talk about generalized linear models as one particularly commonly used tool for relating stimuli to neural responses. And then given time, I'll talk about either both state space models and likelihood for inference, or only about state space models. All right. So the key ingredient of almost all spike train models is the called Poisson process. And the Poisson process is basically a mathematical way of stating that we assume spikes to occur at a fixed rate with no temporal variation at all. So there's just spikes randomly, and that's in the sense of at any point in time is equally likely to see a new spike and not a spike. And that is a very simple, I mean, obviously in many ways that's a terrible model, but as we will find, that's the essential building block we need to build up much more realistic models of spike trains. So mathematically, the probability of a spike train with spike times Tn to Tn with n spike times a window of size t, the probability of the spike train R, given the mean rate, depends on the spike times of these n neurons. But as I just said, there's no temporal structure. It means that the probability of observing these spike times is really the same thing as just really only depends on getting n spikes, right? Because all these different spike times will be the same. And there's a way to express this, and that is the probability of the spike train given mu is given by this formula that is relatively horrible. But one thing that you should do, not as an exercise, but you should do it as an exercise, but it's not in the exercise. Just plug in 0, 1, and 2 into this equation. And we'll find that for low spike counts, this is actually relatively, I mean, much of the messiness goes away. And as we will see later, we'll pretty much only ever apply this distribution in cases where we have 0 or 1 spikes, or 2 spikes. So this ugly factorial here is not really that relevant in practice, because 0 factorial is 1, 1 factorial is 1, and 2 factorial is 2, right? So in almost all cases, this goes away, and then you really end up with a few simple terms. So just as a toy example, let's assume we have some spike trains, spike counts 1 to nk, and we want to learn the mean parameter. We want to learn this rate parameter that tells us how many spikes we expect per second. And kind of talking about the rationale earlier, if we don't have a prior, or we assume a flat prior over some range, let's say, then one way to find that mean is to maximize this log probability. So we can write this as the log probability is just the sum over our m spike trains of the log of the probability of each spike train, so rk, and we can then plug in nk given that mean. That's something I encourage you to do as an exercise. If you do that, you will find the following. So that the maximum likelihood estimate of the mean is 1 over the number of spike trains by the number of the time window times the sum of all these spike counts. Why is this a satisfying outcome? Why likely would you have guessed that this is the outcome without doing any math or knowing anything about the Poisson distribution? Yeah, it's just the empirical average. So in this case, this log likelihood, the maximum likelihood estimated, the quantity that the maximum log is just the empirical average, right? So if you don't know anything about the Poisson distribution, this is what you probably would have done. And this is just to show that these estimators that you derive from likelihood often map onto, but not always, map onto things that are just reasonable, and it would be strange if that wasn't the case. The difference, however, is that, as we will see later, by phrasing it as maximizing likelihood or posterior, we can actually add lots of bells and whistles to it that give us answers even in cases where we don't have simple closed-form solutions.
Sorry, can I ask a question? Originally, I thought you were going to say, like when you started going into this, that you were going to take like discrete time bins and then ask, will this spike occur or not? But you're really asking, like, if we have discrete time bins and information in each, what will our guess as to like mean firing rate be, right? Or
so the question I'm asking is, you have, let's say, 1 second of data, and you can count how many spikes you have in that window, and you want to have use that to come up with an estimate of the firing rate. I'm at the moment, there's no binning at the moment. We will come to binning because obviously in almost all situations, it will be a terrible assumption to assume that over long time periods, firing rates are constant. But we already have the ingredient, and I basically you're just basically saying the next slide. But the answer to that is that because firing rates are not constant, we can split up. We can construct something that's called the inhomogeneous Poisson process, which really means you just split up your time axis into small time bins and assume that within each time bin, things are given by a constant Poisson process. So in this particular case, I can just tell you the way the data was generated was using the following rate profile. So we assume that there's, lots of spiking here and then a small undershoot here. And we can just, as I just said, split up the time axis into many bins and then assume that within each bin, it's Poisson with a rate mu t that depends on the bin index t. And then for each bin, we can calculate the maximum likelihood estimate as before. So if it's one bin, that's just as before, that would be the maximum likelihood estimate. If we do 2 bins, we get a different estimate in each of the 2 bins. And then we can make our axis finer, and we get a better and better approximation. In this case, we're using 25 bins. But there's no reason why we should stop at 25, right? So we can get 50 bins and 100 bins and 200 bins and 500 bins, or in this case, 1,000 bins. And in that case, you see that, well, mathematically, everything is still correct. This maximum likelihood approach completely is breaking down. Because if you just take the maximum likelihood estimate of the rate in each bin to be the average number of spikes in that bin, at the point where your bins are small enough, you will always have exactly 1 or 0 spikes. In this case, we're not quite there yet, but you will get a nonsensical estimate. So why did we get that? Well, because the maximum likelihood here fails. Well, it doesn't fail. It does what it should do, but it's not what we want. Because it doesn't incorporate any assumption about that this rate is smooth across trials. And in a Bayesian approach, we would just say, well, we think things are smooth over time. So the way to do this is to incorporate that into our modeling process, into a prior, using a prior. In this case, a reasonable prior should be such that it assigns high probability to PSTHs that are smooth, and it should assign low probability to PSTHs that are very wiggly. The way to do that in this case is, or one way to do that is using a Gaussian process. I will not talk about the details of Gaussian processes. They have come up before, and if there's still or increased interest in more detailed tutorial in Gaussian processes, I'm happy to add that to the list of tutorials we're going to do this afternoon, but likely it would realistically not be today in the afternoon, but some other time. Okay, but now we can just crank the Bayesian handle in this case, or we're just going for the map for the moment. So our posterior is proportional to the product of the prior and the likelihood. Mathematically or numerically, it's often much better to just put a log in front of it. So the log posterior is the sum of the log likelihood plus the log prior. And then we can maximize this. So we can maximize this log posterior to find the map. So the first term will ensure that our PSTH fits the data, and our second term will ensure that the PSTH is smooth. And we will, I've said we're using Gaussian process here to actually define this quantity. So then we want to maximize this numerically. There's a technical nuisance that we have to deal with. So how can we numerically maximize this? Well, firing rates, and therefore obviously the estimate of the firing rate in bin have to be non-negative. It doesn't make sense to have a negative firing rate, right? So there's a very easy trick to make sure that we have negative firing rates and saying, well, we assume the firing rate is just the exponential of some underlying lambda. So rather than optimizing the mu's, we optimize the lambdas, right? And then because exponential always gives you non-negative or positive outcomes, if we optimize over lambda, we will always get firing rates that are positive. So how do we find that? Well, we use gradient descent to find the maximum of, in this case, the log posterior. For the particular model that I've described so far, this posterior has a desirable property, namely that it's concave. So if we start gradient descent at any point, gradient descent starts at some point and it just always walks up the slope till you are at the peak. And partially inspired by Tim's presentation on Monday. I made this slightly cheesy visualization. So we assume that this is our initial guess of parameters, and then we walk up the log likelihood until we get to the peak, right? So given that it's concave, we will always get to the global peak, which would not be true if this was a non-concave log likelihood, in which case there's some probability that we actually get stuck somewhere in between. So we get to this intermediate peak, and it would have to go down a little bit to go to the maximum peak, but as it's gradient descent, it's just stuck here because there's no more gradient. It is already at the top. But for the particular class of models that I'm going to talk about in the entire first half of the talk, they have this extremely convenient but somewhat rare property that we know this doesn't happen. We can mathematically prove that they always have this concave shape. All right. After this long run-up, well, we will calculate these gradients in exercise. For the example I showed you before, if this is the true PSDH or the true firing rate distribution that I showed before, using a Gaussian process prior, in this case, if you do this numerical optimization, we will find this estimated PSDH, which is not perfect, and we wouldn't expect it to be perfect, but it corresponds much more to our intuitions than this weird empirical average that I showed earlier. There's actually more information in this log posterior than we're using so far. Namely, if we look at the two peaks, right? If we look at this optimization, this log posterior that we maximized, it could either be extremely strongly peaked or could be very shallow. And this would tell us that if we make a tiny change to our parameters, the log likelihood drops dramatically. That would be this scenario. Whereas in this scenario, we would know that a tiny change to the log likelihood really doesn't affect our parameters all that much. So that would mean we have a big posterior uncertainty, and that would mean we have a small posterior uncertainty. And we can formalize this to calculate error bars. And we can use this as a cheap way to construct Gaussian approximations to the posterior. So we can assume that the posterior over lambda, given our data, is given by a Gaussian, where we just approximate the mean by the lambda map, and we approximate the covariance by this posterior covariance, which is given by a quantity that's mathematically called the Hessian. All this is a measure of how curved, so it's just the second derivatives of the log posterior. And this, if mathematically it turns out that if you take the matrix of second order derivatives and you approximate that, that gives you an estimate of the posterior covariance that is related to what in physics you would have as a saddle point approximation. So this is, there's some mathematical reasoning for why this is reasonable. The problem with it is that it's really only based on the derivatives around that point. So it's not a very good, it's a practical and cheap way to do it, but it's not actually good. There's much better ways to get Gaussian approximations, either through MCMC sampling or expectation propagation or variational inference. All of these are things I will not talk about in the tutorial. I'm happy to talk about them later, but they get into more technical and advanced stuff. In this case, we can use that to calculate error bars. So I'm plotting now the error bars for the PSDH. In any of these error bars, we always have to remember that error bars are model-based and depend on the prior. So by changing your prior, that will change your error bars. In Bayesian inference, that's perfectly fine. That's what you would want to have, because your prior uncertainty should be also reflected in your posterior uncertainty, but it's just important to keep that in mind. And as I said before, this Laplace approximation is a local large sample approximation and requires that you're differentiable at this peak. So there are technical limitations to when this is useful. OK, so now we have spikes. The firing rate changes over time, but there's still many reasons why real spiking is not Poisson, right? We might have refractive periods, give us kind of interspike intervals that don't have two spikes directly next to each other. We might have bursting or we might have oscillation. So all of this is not captured by an inhomogeneous Poisson process, but there's a very easy trick to get this to work. And namely, rather than having the firing rate is the exponential of this lambda, we just say the firing rate is now the exponential of lambda plus some history term, and that history term, we will make that a function of the recent spiking activity. So what this means is, we'll mean that we take some spiking kernel, in this case it's to model refractoriness. So when you observe a spike, that means that we kind of like a feedback current, we modify the probability of a spike in the next window to be much lower. So the firing rate at any moment in time is influenced by the weighted sum of past spikes weighted by this penalty term. So we have the strong penalty at time 0. It means if we just had a spike the time before, let's say we just had a spike at time t minus 1, and we multiply with a very negative weight, then it would dramatically decrease the estimate of the firing rate for the next step. And this allows us to capture refractoriness, but just whenever we see a spike, push down the probability of a spike on the next. The W's So this is this 1W for how does a spike on the previous time modify my probability? How does a spike 2 times ago modify my spike probability? So you can just say, as a function of how far I am in the past, how does that modify my spike probability? Let me show you the next slide. I think that might clarify some of that. I just want to say these are parameters, so we can get them by maximizing the log likelihood or doing full Bayesian inference before. But let me show, for the example I showed earlier, the corresponding history filters. So if you want to model refractoriness, you wouldn't want to have a filter that really penalizes with a strong negative weight if you had a spike 1 time bit in the past. And that would mean you don't spike twice in a row. If you want to model bursting, you would want to have a model, let's say you still want refractoriness, but then if like a couple of times in the past, you want to have an increased probability of spiking because spikes come in packets, right? So that kind of filter would allow you to model that. If you want to model oscillations, you would want to have a history filter where the probability of a spike goes up and down depending on how many cycles you are in the past. Jonathan Pillow has made some very nice demos to illustrate this, which I'm just showing here. So at the moment, first he's just showing a homogeneous Poisson process during the stimulus time. So we see spikes at random, and the spike probability is constant as a function of time. If we have a filter that after spike goes strongly negative before it goes back up, it just means that after spike, this neuron will be inhibited for a precise moment of time, which means you get this very regular spiking because there's basically this inhibition or this statistical inhibition for some time period before you allow that cell to spike again, and that results in very regular spiking. If you want to model adaptation, you could use a filter that after spike for a long period inhibits future spikes. So with that framework, your filter outputs you will start spiking, and that will inhibit future spikes. So you can model a neuron that starts spiking at the beginning, but then gets inhibited by this post-spike filter and then stops spiking. And again, if you want to model bursting, you can have a filter where you have an over and undershoot in this case. So in his model, you start spiking, then you get a lot of other spikes, then it gets inhibited, you stop spiking, and you do. So this just illustrates this extremely simple construction of having a linear history kernel in this very simple model can give you a rich dynamical repertoire of spiking. Talking about kind of different models and realism of the models, this is a purely phenomenological statistical description, right? These post-spike filters just reflect the statistics of your spike train, and they might give insights into or sort of allow hypotheses for what the underlying mechanisms are, but it doesn't, there's nothing, none of these parameters has any biophysical meaning. Okay. As you might say, and now I think at this point it should be obvious that spiking also depends on the stimulus. So if you have a neuron, let's say in a retin ganglion cell, then if that cell spikes here, will strongly depend on what the stimulus was before that, because that's the point of sensory neurons, that they are correlated or informative about the stimuli that preceded that spike. And you might want to model how the set of stimuli that preceded a spike influences that spike. And we can also do that in this framework by using exactly the same trick as before. We include, rather than a history kernel, we now include a stimulus kernel. That is something that's often called the receptor field, which modulates spiking. So in this case, our local firing, we have the stimulus kernel that's just a weighted function of past spikes. So in this case, our firing rate will be exponential of a term that's linear in the stimulus plus a term that's linear in the history. So we can add more and more regressors into this framework, and when we put it all together, that is the statistical framework that's typically known as generalized linear models. So it's basically a statistical tool that allows you to model a rich set of dependencies that modulate neural spiking, and allows you to capture, for example, spike rate, the effect, the modulation of firing rate just by time in this fixed trial scenario that I described at the beginning, by stimulus, by spike history and whatnot. And the way to conceptualize is that we might have a stimulus that is convolved by a receptor field that gives us that stimulus term. And then there's also this post-spike filter. Both of these are pushed through an exponential nonlinearity, and then you do probabilistic spiking, in this case Poisson spiking, with that probability. I should say that we can also use other probability models here. In fact, in one of the exercises, we will use a Bernoulli variable here. But something you're free to add, I mean, with some restrictions, other nonlinearities here and other probability models here. All right, everything I've said here, just if you lump everything together, it really doesn't matter whether these terms come from the stimulus or the recent past. what generalized linear models really mean is you have your firing rate and you assume it's some exponential of some linear combination of some weights with some covariates. So these ZIs here can either be your last spike or the stimulus or anything you want to put in your model. So we can use that framework to model dependence of firing rate on any covariate, ZI, that might influence spiking or might not influence spiking. Because if you put something in and then train the model, it might assign a weight of 0 to it, right? In that case, we know, well, we thought it might influence spiking, but in reality, it doesn't. I should also say that generalized linear model means it's linear in these parameters, but the ZIs can be nonlinear functions of your data, right? So if you assume your neuron is sensitive not to the to the contrast, but let's say to the log contrast, well, then you just say Zi is the log contrast, not the contrast. So you can model nonlinear dependencies, but you have to construct them by hand. And then it has to be linear in the parameters. A slightly simpler case, if without these bells and whistles, this is typically often called the linear nonlinear Poisson neuron, right? Because you have a linear stage, receptor field, and you have a nonlinear stage, and then you have Poisson. So the LMP is a special case of the scenario where you don't have this fanciness, and you have Poisson here, and you have exponential here, or some other nonlinearity. Just very quickly, this framework has been used a lot by Jonathan Pillow, Liam Paninsky, and others to give accurate phenomenological model of spike trains. So this is an example of a retinal ganglion cell recording in response to a full-field flicker stimulus. And they showed that if you try to model these responses using a GLM without history, so an LMP, you cannot really capture the precision of spike trains, whereas if you use a GLM that has these spike history kernels, you can get much more precise, or you can capture the experimental data much more accurately, and this also reflects in a better match with the PCHs. So in these models, the fact that you can fit your data is something that tells you that you can use that model to model your data, but it doesn't directly. So if you can fit your model with an LMP, if you cannot fit it with an LMP, but you can fit it with a GLM that has spike history couplings, that tells you that you need these spike history effects to account for your data. Yeah. So you can always, given a sufficiently complex model, you can fit any data, right? But what complexity you need to add gives you information about what complexity there is in the data. So that's one half the answer. On a more quantitative level, you can always say, well, one way to compare different models that might have different number of parameters by looking at their generalization performance. So you might fit a model to one data set, and that might have a ton of parameters. And then you look at how this generalizes to another data set. And if you have over-parameterized your model, it's likely going to generalize very poorly. So this is a practical way to see which of the many parameters you're adding are likely needed and not just overfitting your data. Obviously, neurons are embedded in networks. So if a neuron spikes or not will often depend on what other neurons in that network are doing. Again, we can add that in like before, and by just adding more terms that model the dependence of a neuron on the spiking of other neurons. I think at this point, it's very important to point out that if we fit that kind of model to data and we find that we need to include a coupling from some other neuron onto that neuron to capture the correlation firing rate, this is not to be misinterpreted as evidence for the fact that there's some anatomical connection, right? There's a purely statistical description of the dependencies of these neurons, and it might well be that, for example, that both of these neurons get common input from a third neuron, and if you've not observed that third neuron, then whenever that neuron spikes, the other one will spike, so that will make you include a coupling in that. So this is a statistical description of your data, and one has to be very careful when mapping that onto putative underlying mechanisms. That's just what I said, so you can make this model bigger by including the effects of other neurons, but you can still fit it using exactly the same log likelihood maximization or more fancy Bayesian techniques that I described at the beginning. And I'm just going to skip this, but Jonathan and others also showed in the Nature paper that, again, you can get accurate fits of this to retinal ganglion cell responses. And in fact, they studied which of these interactions you need to include in order to capture that. Because I agree with you. At some point, it's not surprising that if you add more bells and whistles, you will be able to capture a richer set of data. And so the question is, which one of these do you need? And then that tells you at least gives you information about what features are in the data. All right. Before I break for the break, I'm also adding a one-page. So this is the special bonus part of this lecture. I'm adding one slide on everything you need to know about deep neural networks in one slide without any equations. So after the course, if they ask you, did you also learn about deep neural nets? You can say yes. So what is a deep neural net? Well, all you have to do is stack multiple LN models on top of each other. So rather than having an LNP model, you would have an LNP model, right? And in the end, if your data is not Poisson, you would just have a Gaussian distribution. That would be LN Gaussian model, right? So lots of LNs and then some distribution at the end. Then, as before, you use gradient descent to maximize the log likelihood. So nothing new there. Just terminology is a bit confusing. So the log likelihood, at least for binary data, they typically call the cross entropy. So you just have to get used to have to make the mapping in language. But all this is gradient descent to maximize the log likelihood. Part of the success of deep neural networks is they invented a set of software tools, for example, Theano, TensorFlow, Autograd, that allow you to calculate the gradients for gradient descent for you without you having to do it. So you don't need to know high school maths anymore to use deep neural networks, which means that the set of possible users for these is much bigger. I should also say these software tools don't only calculate the gradient for you, but you also implement it in a particularly computationally efficient way.
I'm only asking you because this type actually changes the meaning. What you mean is no more rather than now more, right?
No, I obviously mean no more, yes. Also, no more basic command of spelling needed. There's a bunch of tricks that will help, like adding a particular kind of noise called mini-batching, using fancy adaptive gradient methods. Many of these are actually implemented in the software tools, so while you might need them, you might not actually have to understand them. And the other important ingredient is that you must not worry about local maxima. So when I said earlier that your method will get stuck at local maxima, for deep neural networks, it just doesn't seem to happen. And there's more theoretical work on why this is happening or why this is not happening, but I think it suffices to know that in deep neural networks, you don't really have to worry about it, and most of the time things are fine. One reason for that is because by adding this noise, this provides you a way, if you do gradient descent, even if you are at a local maximum, that the noise might push you to a higher maximum that it eventually allows you to get to the top. So, but in terms of the mathematical approach, if you understand map, you understand how to train a neural network, you don't have to know the gradient yourself, and you must not worry about local maxima, and then it's the same thing as fitting a GLM to your data. And with that, I suggest we take a break. So I argue that GLMs give you a flexible way to model how various factors that you might care about influence the probability that a neuron spikes. But there might be effects that modulate neural spiking that you can't observe directly. There might be latent variables or some things that you can't measure directly that determine whether neuron spikes or not. And this is something you cannot put in the GLM, right? You have to observe something to put it into that formula. Just as an illustration, let's say we might have two populations that kind of are firing, and it kind of looks like there's some latent underlying oscillation that makes these neurons fire together at some kind of in some intervals, and these other neurons might be doing something else. So this suggests that there's some underlying latent process that modulates neural firing in such a way that the red neurons fire together with that temporal profile and the blue neurons fire together with that other temporal profile. And we would like to be able to extract such underlying modulatory influences, and that's something you can't directly do with a GLM because you're not observing it directly, and therefore you can't put it into your formula. So we could set up a GLM where we say, well, for every neuron we assume it's governed by GLM, and I have to admit I changed notation from I call the spike response Y now, whereas earlier I gave it some other letter. So we assume there's some common input, not in the kind of physiological sense, but in a statistical, and there's some underlying latent variable that modulates these neurons together or not. And then we can learn a coupling, or we can model a coupling C that tells us how much each of those neurons is modulated by that latent input. So there's kind of a receptive field that couples every neuron to that latent input. Let me give you the formula. We assume that the firing rate of neuron I is given by an exponential of its weight times the current state of the latent input. So if you put this in matrix form, the matrix, the vector of firing rates is given by pointwise exponential of the C matrix that in this case would tell us the coupling from every neuron or from each latent input to the neuron. If X is one-dimensional, then C would just be a vector where each CI tells us how strongly that neuron is influenced by the latent modulator. And then we can write up, so let's for the moment assume we know what X is. So if we did know what X is, then this would just be a GLM. And we could find the coupling C by maximizing the log likelihood, right? Because that just, if X is known, this would just be a GLM. We put in the log likelihood, can add a prior to it, and we can maximize the log likelihood over C, assuming we know X. If you look at that formula carefully, we see it's actually symmetric in C and X, right? So while we decided that X is the latent state and C are the parameters, in reality, these are just two numbers or two vectors that are multiplied together. So we can also interpret this formula the other way around. So we can say, well, if we know C, if we did know C, if someone magically gave us what the couplings are, we would be able to maximize the log likelihood over X. So if we did know the couplings, we would be able to infer what the most likely common input is. But the catch is, we know neither C or X, right? So while it's kind of cute that we could optimize one knowing the other, it's practically seems useless. But the nice thing is that there's a principal way to iterate between optimizing C and optimizing X that is guaranteed to give us a local maximum of the log likelihood. And I'll try to just share some intuition on how this works, but not go into the underlying mathematics so much. So this algorithm is called the M algorithm, and this slide is on the good, the bad, and the ugly of latent variables. So the good is what I just said. We can solve this apparent chicken and egg problem. So we don't know the common input, we don't know the parameters, iteratively, by alternating between updating our estimate of the parameter C and estimating our belief in the latent input X. And that is the posterior distribution over X. The catch is, and this is the bad, it's not sufficient to just maximize finding the best C and the most likely input X. But for EM to be well defined, we have to maximize over C, and we have to estimate the full posterior distribution over X. So we need to, because we need to sum over or integrate over all likely input X, we need the posterior over X given Y and C, P of X given, Y and C. So we can just maximize over C like in a GLM, but over X we need to find the full posterior distribution. But remember at the beginning I told you at least about a cheap way to approximate the posterior distribution, right? So I said, well, we can approximate that posterior distribution by a Gaussian, and we just assume that the mean of that Gaussian is given by the mode, and we use this trick, this Laplace approximation to approximate the covariance matrix. So while just maximizing, to sum up, while just maximizing over X is not enough, taking the maximum over X and then using the trick to find the covariance allows us to approximately integrate over all likely inputs. And this is called the expectation maximization algorithm, or particular variant of the expectation maximization algorithm. The ugly details are that EM only converges to a local maximum, not necessarily a global one. So if you draw that likelihood landscape as before, EM doesn't necessarily find the global maximum, but hopefully finds a good one. And I should only say that the way I've described EM here is only approximate. And if you want to be very rigorous for non-Gaussian models, like this is a non-Gaussian model, we need to approximate. We need approximate solutions. In this case, variational EM would be a family of approximate solutions. This doing multiple restarts is can be pretty useless in high-dimensional spaces because the number of restarts you might need can grow very quickly. So while doing multiple restarts can be useful, there are cases where where either, high-dimensional space is basically either any way you restart is where you initialize is fine or nowhere is fine. But if you just randomly try 100, it's probably as good as trying 1 because you would have to try a million to sample your space. You could also start with a random estimated mean and covariance of X. So your initial estimate of the posterior, you could start with a random estimate. I should say this is just this is not a precise statement of EM. This is a kind of this tries to convey an intuition on how we can exploit kind of the symmetry between parameters and latent variables as a way to design an iterative optimization algorithm that in some cases is guaranteed to converge, in some cases gives an approximation that will kind of converge to something, although we're not guaranteed that it is a maximum. But I think the more important point is that there are principal ways that we can get ourselves out of this seemingly chicken-egg problem that we don't know what the parameters are and we don't know what the latent variables are. This is a bit of an aside, and possibly Mate disagrees, but I think in Bayesian inference, in a funny way, there is the distinction between what do you call a latent variable and what do you call a parameter is actually somewhat arbitrary. So I could go back here and say, well, I think C is also a latent variable. I call my parameters a latent variable and I do full Bayesian inference. Sorry, I could say X is a parameter and C is a parameter. And I want to do full Bayesian inference over everything. So when I estimate the full joint posterior over C and X, that would be the full Bayesian treatment of that model. You do Bayesian inference over everything that's unknown. So the fact that I said C is a parameter, we're going to maximize C, and X is a latent variable, we're going to integrate over X, that's a decision that I made as when I designed my inference algorithm. But there's nothing a priori that says we have to treat C as a parameter and X as a latent variable. In Bayesian inference, if you think about it strictly, there's only observed data, and every parameter is a latent variable. So a hardcore Bayesian would just say there are no parameters, everything is a latent variable. Because you never fit. You only ever approximate or calculate posterior distributions. So for full Bayesian, there are no parameters. There's only latent variables. For Bayesian that tries to get things done with a finite time budget, you often have to make a decision what you call a parameter and what you maximize and what you call a latent variable over which you integrate. But this is a kind of a technical side point that if that was confusing, just you'd never have to worry about it unless you want to join Mate's lab. Okay, so a full Bayesian would try to get the joint posterior over both X and C. And as Mate pointed out, once you have the joint posterior, you can do everything. Yeah? So if you can get the joint posterior, that's always what you want to get. Just getting that joint posterior might be extremely difficult. And the extremely cheap answer would be just to not be any Bayesian at all. So rather than just finding the distribution of latent inputs that consist in our data, we just find the most likely common input and the most likely C. So in this EM step, we maximize on X, we maximize on C, we find the most likely input, find the most likely set of parameters. In many cases, this intermediate ground is most useful, that we represent the full posterior over some X, and we maximize the likelihood over the parameters. And this tends to often be, this C here should be on the other side. So in this case, we decided to represent or approximate the full posterior of X, given these things, and we decided to maximize the marginal, in this case, likelihood over C. So probability of C given Y is called the marginal likelihood because we're integrating out X. Okay, so I tried to just convey an intuition for how EM could work. I certainly did not include all the details, and the details become also messy depending on what kind of problem you work with. Given that I'm surprisingly doing well on time, I will also talk about the last point. And this is really kind of directly ties into current work we do in the group, in particular work that Pedro is working on. So we're asking the question of how can you do, I said the difficulty with Bayesian inference is the fact that we have to normalize our posterior. And I always took for granted that we have the likelihood, right? That we can just take the product of the prior times the likelihood. But there might actually be cases in which the likelihood itself is either, it's very difficult to compute, or very expensive to compute. So we have to find ways to do Bayesian inference without knowing any likelihoods. And these are cases that we likely will care about a lot if we do any mechanistic modeling in neuroscience. So let's say you're interested in fitting Hodgkin-Huxley models to some complicated data, and you have some internal noise sources that you want to estimate. And just as a toy illustration, let's say you have some Hodgkin-Huxley model, and you want to model the response of a neuron to a step current input. Well, what the Hodgkin-Huxley model gives you, it tells you is given parameters, in this case a set of maximal conductances, and given a stimulus, it allows you to generate data from this model. Right? This is what a forward model, what a mechanistic model, this is what any model gives you. You start with some parameters, you start with a stimulus, and it generates some data. In Bayesian inference, we go the other direction. Right? We start with X, we start with some data X, and we want to do inference. So we want to find the set of parameters, the posterior distribution, which is the set of parameters that could have generated that data. And for the Hodgson-Huxley, I mean, this forward step all of you could do, right? You just write up a Hodgson-Huxley model. You maybe take XPP or you take some other tool. You feed in your parameters and you feed in some noise and you can generate data with it. And at no point did you write down a likelihood. There's an implicit likelihood in the sense that the underlying likelihood mathematically exists, but there's no term that allows you to write down this is the likelihood. And if you don't have the likelihood, there's no term that allows you to calculate the posterior. So what do you do in that scenario? Just if you have that kind of mechanistic models where inference is intractable, in fact, this is said posterior is often hard to compute, and that has to do with the fact of having to compute that denominator. But in this case, it's a bit worse because we also don't have these likelihood. And in this case, we're assuming they're not tractable, so we can't directly plug them in. And there's a set of statistical techniques that tries to deal with that scenario. That is known as likelihood-free inference, unsurprisingly. But it's a bit of a misnomer because there is a likelihood. It's just an implicit likelihood, and we don't have a formula for the likelihood. So it should really be called intractable likelihood inference. But it's somehow historically it's called likelihood-free inference. The other term for it is ABC, approximate Bayesian computation. I think it's equally misleading because there's very many, I mean, almost any computation that you do in Bayesian statistics, apart from when working with a very restricted class of models, is approximate. So approximate Bayesian computation could really apply to almost all Bayesian inference, but in reality, it's reserved for likelihood-free inference, which itself is also misnomer because it should be called intractable likelihood inference. But it's difficult to change historical terminology, and if you don't want to confuse people, you have to stick to it, and so I'm just going to say likelihood-free inference. So the algorithm, there's many ways to do this. I'm just going to talk about a particular way we do this that bases on older work by Bloom and François and kind of extends more recent work by Papa Macarius and Ian Murray on taking this approach. So what's the gist of this approach? Well, the gist of this approach is this is the thing we have. So we have a simulator, and we want to fit some data. And we have given some data trace that we want to fit. So one thing we can do is just take our model and simulate different data traces from it. So we randomly pick different parameters and generate different, and from different parameters, we spit out different data sets. So this creates a family of different parameters paired with a family of different data sets they produce. So what is Bayesian inference? Bayesian inference says, given some data, what is the distribution of a parameter that generates us? So we now generated a training set that allows us to do this. So given a simulated data set, we can, in this case, train a neural network that tries to predict what parameters generated this data set. So we use a big simulation where we sample very many points, generate very many data points, and train a neural network to approximate the mapping from this reverse mapping from data to inputs. And then we can use that to do Bayesian inference. So the idea is to train, in this case, a probabilistic deep neural network, because we want to approximate a posterior distribution, not just a single set of parameters, to approximate this posterior distribution on the simulated data set. So he said you need some prior that allows you to determine what parameter values you want to simulate from. And that is a practical problem. So if you have a very big prior, then you would have to generate a gigantic data set to ever produce a data set that looks like the data you care about. Right? So this would be horribly inefficient for large data spaces. So the nice thing about this approach is that you can do it in iterative fashion. You pick some parameter, you generate some data with it, and then if that data looks like your real data, then when you generate the next set of parameters, you would take similar parameters. So whenever you generate data, you can use that to update your posterior approximation, and that you can use to update to decide where you want to sample next. We're doing full Bayesian inference in this case. So we want the full distribution over the parameters of the model given the data. We never fit parameters. We want the posterior distribution.
But what if your model is wrong?
Yeah, that's what I would.
If your model is wrong, then you will get the posterior distribution over parameters that tries to do the best job at capturing the mapping it tries to do the best job at fitting your data. And then you would use that. And then when you go to box loop, you would be at the model criticism stage, and you would look at output from your model compared to the real data, and you would find that you're not satisfied by the data that your model produces, and you would think about how you want to change your model, and then that would put you back into the design stage, and you would start running again. So all of these inference techniques, they typically give you one of those arrows in box loop, right? For example, here we're just talking about calculating the posterior distribution of a model given parameters. That's one of the arrows in box loop. And then, but you have to string together multiple such operations in order to do full data analysis or modeling. Well, I think the classical modeling approach in this case really tries to characterize the full space of behaviors that the model could have. And then only later you actually look at your data and find where in that big parameter space does your real data live. So if you care about characterizing that model over all its possible behaviors it could exhibit, then this is the right thing to do. But if you really want to focus on reproducing or modeling the data that you've empirically observed, that means you're possibly wasting a lot of time and effort to characterize the behavior or model in a regime that is completely away from reality. So in that sense, I think conceptually the difference is, do you want to characterize your model, or do you start by characterizing your model and then you look at data, or do you want to start by looking at data and make inference about you only ever look at those models that give you something that looks like the data? So I don't think one is better or the other one, but the kind of the flavor and the focus, the topic of interest is a bit different. But this is almost a discussion point, so please, other people, like Mate.
But I think to me the main difference is that one is based on a lot of prior knowledge about what summary statistics of the data are the most informative as to the underlying parameters or features of parameters that we care about, whereas the other is much more black box.
You're not only, so a technical bit that I left out, but could have said is most often but you can do it both ways, but most often you don't train your neural network directly on the data, but you train it on those features of the data that you're interested in. So you could just extract your data, calculate the power spectrum, and say, we want to calculate the set of parameters, the posterior distribution that gives us that power spectrum. So not only can you combine the two, but in fact, a detail left out is that this step of computing summary statistics I already care about is often done. I think the big difference is, do you really try to characterize the full model space, or do you only focus on those that give you a particular data set? And if you want to characterize a model, then obviously you should characterize the model, right? And this might be informative.
Can I also have a technical question about how you fit the model, but rather than the input, what's the output there? So the output, the target output is a particular parameter setting, right? Because
here,
you generate
okay.
particular parameter set with which you generated the data. But in the end, you want your DNN to.
So that's the cost function.
Give you a full distribution.
I can give you the cost function. Okay. So the cost function. So the parameters of our neural network are, I'll just call them phi. I mean, this is a messy slide. Now I would have skipped it if Mate hadn't asked. But, so you can. So the loss function. So the neural network we have is a mixture density network. So we approximate the posterior distribution by mixture of Gaussians, which means that this complicated neural network spits out the different mixture components of a Gaussian model, but that is a technical detail I will not talk about. But how are we training this? Well, the most important part is this part here. So we do density estimation. We want the neural network to assign high probability to parameters that correspond to data we sampled. So we maximize the log likelihood of the sample parameters given the simulated data. This is the first part of the loss function. However, in the end, we really only care about data sets that look similar like the true data sets. So we allow ourselves to have this calibration term, this calibration kernel that basically says, if your simulated data is very far away from the empirical data, we don't care about approximating that. So we only care about getting the likelihood right for those mappings between simulated data and parameters that produce data that looks like real data. And then this here is a technical term. I said earlier we do this adaptive sampling of parameters. So we sample parameters that we think will generate data that looks like the real one. So we don't sample from the prior. Mathematically, we should sample for the prior. So if we don't sample from the prior, we have to correct for that. So there's a correction factor that takes into account that while we should sample from the prior, we do this adaptive sampling. And there's a technical, so when we do this iterative optimization that we sample new data, we optimize our parameters again, it's technically desirable that our parameters don't change too much from one round to the next. So we have this penalty term that means if we run this loop, this adaptive loop, that we don't change the parameters too much from one step to the next. As more technical detail, we don't actually we do double Bayesian in this case. So we don't try to maximize the phi, but we actually get the posterior distribution over the parameters. So this is the posterior distribution over the parameters of our model that approximate the posterior distribution. So there will be an additional integral over this thing that, that corresponds to different samples of the parameters. If you have many parameters, all you will get is a very dispersed posterior distribution. It will just tell you that your model is not well constrained by the data. So if you have too many parameters, full Bayesian inference tells you. And its way of telling you is by saying, look, there's these gigantic posterior distributions that don't constrain any of your parameters well. Whenever I've struggled with something, Bayesian inference, typically, if you just follow the recipe, in the end, it gives you the right answer. For example, things like, oh, do we have to correct for the number of parameters? No, you don't. It does it for you. We actually had trouble here with a review comment that said, oh, the way you define this loss function here seems like it should increase with the number of rounds, but it doesn't. And we worked through Bayesian inference carefully, and it says, no, the way the loss function came out of just approximating the joint posterior was the right. So I think one of the beauties for me of the Bayesian framework is that whenever you have a practical data analysis problem, the answer to solve it is often you just stick to the Bayesian recipe. How exactly to do that and how to implement it in any finite time, that can be very difficult. But conceptually, it's almost always been the case that just sort of trusting the procedure was the worked out in the end.
I mean, is there a kind of information theoretical interpretation of that? Because it looks like, I mean, I think I think a while ago I read something from Macke, this book that actually you have there, I think. Mm-hmm. And there's this Occam's razor interpretation, which is a very coding approach to say, well, if you have more parameters, then you're basically have more parameters that could have a mistake. And he gives a very, I don't know how to say it, like it's a very informational theoretical argument. You can actually write a formula for it somehow.
Yeah, yeah. If you had asked me where to read up on that, I would have said take the Macke book or take the Rasmussen Williams book. Both of them have this plot that they say if you do model selection in, so if you have a model that has too many parameters, then you will have a big posterior that doesn't constrain these parameters, and that if you integrate over this big posterior will make that model perform less well than a model that has fewer number of parameters but has them in the right place. So in this case, we're just doing statistic. You know the stimulus, you know the output, you want to fit a model that relates it. It's very, conceptually, this is very simple. This is fitting a neural model to data. The only two tricks are we want to do Bayesian inference, despite the fact that we don't have likelihoods. But other than that, this is just standard parameter fitting.
But you can imagine to have a stimulus that is, I mean, an input that is unobserved, and you could basically treat it as a parameter or parameters.
Yeah.
So
we don't know how well that works, but
yeah, it could depend.
yeah, that would be much harder. Just last slide, this actually works. So to check whether this works, we apply this to a model where we can calculate the posterior distribution precisely. This is a GLM. So this is a GLM where we assume the white noise, sorry, not a white noise, but some randomly fluctuating input with a receptor field that's given by some temporal filter, and then it produced, in this case, binary spikes. We can here show, so in the true parameters are shown in blue. That's where the parameters were used to generate the data, but we actually want the posterior mean over parameters, which is not necessarily the true parameters. In this case, the true posterior mean is given by the brown line that's here called ES-MCMC, because we calculated that brown line by elliptical slice sampling Markov chain Monte Carlo, which was one of the techniques that I said earlier. If you want a better approximation to the posterior, that you should use MCMC, and this is a particular kind of MCMC we used. The light blue line is the output of our model that we call SNAPE, sequential neural posterior estimation, and it is very close to the true value. Obviously, given that this is a model for which we have likelihoods, it would be completely stupid to apply SNAPE in practice. because there's a much easier way to approximate this posterior distribution, but it's a nice test case to show that this can work. Same thing is true for the posterior covariance. So this is the true posterior covariance, and this is the posterior covariance estimated by the algorithm, and they match well. We've also started applying this to biophysical model. This is a 12 free parameter model from Pospischel et al. 2008 that we just used as an, sorry, that has more parameters, but there's 12 of those we decide to do Bayesian inference over. Again, this is on simulated data, so we first simulate some data, that's the original data, and then we want to find a model that allows us, so we simulate some data, and then we ask the question, if we have the data, what statements can we make about the parameters that generate the data, and then compare that to the true parameters. When we run the model, it generates posterior traces that look very similar to the original data. If one did align them, which Pedro's slide on this does, mine doesn't do it yet, you find there's some mismatch between them. It's not a perfect match, but it's a reasonably good match. More nicely, we can get posterior distribution over all parameters. In this case, the posterior distribution is a 12-dimensional space, so this is pretty hard to visualize. It's much easier to visualize two-dimensional spaces. So we therefore estimate every two-dimensional, we show every two-dimensional projection of that space. And you can see, and in red we plot the true parameters, and we see that in almost all cases, the true parameters are in a region of probability space where there's high posterior mass. So the posterior is peaked at the true values, as you would expect. The posterior tells us about what parameters are not so well constrained by data. And it can even tell us about correlations in the posterior. For example, in some cases, it might be that both parameters are not well constrained by the data, but their ratio is, right? For example, for conductance and other things. So this is a kind of information you can read off the posterior distribution. What are the best fitting parameters? How much scatter is there, and what kind of correlations there are? And on average, as you can see here, the true parameters are always within the error bars as given by the posterior distribution. And the fact that these error bars are so big, that's not a failure of the model, but that's just a statement about the fact that from limited data, you cannot constrain these parameters better. So this is a problem, but not the problem. It's not a problem of the inference algorithm. It's just a problem of the data it's applied to. All right. And with that, I want to close. So I just want to give you a taste on how we can take these simple Bayesian models and try to push them into regimes where we don't have the convenience of having likelihoods or convex likelihoods and all these things, that the formalism itself still applies as it does for simple models, just the work you have to put in to make it work is more, which is what's keeping us busy. All right. And with that, I want to thank my group members, and in particular Pedro and Jan Mattes, who were working on the last part of the talk where I was mostly talking about current work. Thank you very much.